This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on constitutional values and fundamental principles of the Indian Constitution. The participants are Professor Subrato Mukherjee, political analyst, and Lalima Aneja Dang, AIR correspondent.
Well, today is being celebrated as the Constitution Day. It's also called the National Law Day, and it is celebrated every year on the 26th of November to commemorate the adoption of the Constitution of India. The Constitutional Assembly of India adopted the Constitution of India, and it came into force on the 26th of January 1950. In 2015, the central government decided to celebrate 26th of November as the Constitution Day. Professor Mukherjee, of course, we know that 2015 we also celebrated the 125th birth anniversary of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, the father of Indian Constitution. But other than that, what do you think was the idea, what the intention behind the government to mark this as a Constitution Day?
Lalima, it's a good thing that has been done, because if you really look to what is the Constitution, Constitution is a power map in which the distribution of power and authority is distributed in a nation, and India being a large nation, a civilizational state, it has many components. It's a federal constitution, but it has also many other dimensions, because unlike many other federations, our diversity and the unity is at a very different category with a cultural side to it, and there is a large number of homogeneity that is reflected, but also the heterogeneity. So it's a balancing act, and in the context of our constitution, I think one can reasonably say that it has acted very well. And if you really look to the comment of Grenville Austin, he says that it has served quite well for the country, and that I think is quite complimentary and encouraging for us.
Professor Mukherjee, we go back to December 1946 when a team of 192 men and 15 women was formed to draft the Constitution. What do you think were the factors that led to the fact that we did adopt some of its, elements from the constitutions of developed nations like the UK and Australia?
First, we should look to the historical evolution of constitutionalism in India. 1909, 1919, 1935, from which a large portion of the constitution is taken, is the familiarity with the constitution process and also the reasonableness with which it can be adapted to the Indian situation. That's why if you really look to the proposal of a Gandhian constitution, did not merit quite a bit of discussion, though it was generally agreed that it was quite a good document. Because the important preference was to make a constitution that will work in a situation where India was a divided nation at that time, and also the manifold tasks of development in the background of the 200 years of underdevelopment under the British Raj. You remember the drain theory of Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt. It was a stupendous task to make a nation, as Ambedkar also pointed out. Srinivas Banerjee actually said that his autobiography is nation in making, but when we come to the Constitution, we find the fulfillment and we find the process of a complete nation beginning.
So how do you see the 7 fundamental principles which have been enshrined in the Constitution?
Well, they are often described as the 7 flowers. You see, the objective of our constitution making was quite a difficult one. They had to balance between fundamental rights, directive principles, and that's a very important segment of social justice, and then also the role of the Supreme Court, which is inevitable in a constitutional democracy, especially in a federation. Now, if you go by the entire process, what the attempt was, as Habermas says, to make India based on a constitutional citizenship. So rights and duties, the limitations, and also the problems that are all taken into consideration. For instance, the debate on reservation and why the time limit was put and then it was extended again and again. All because there was a larger realization that India is a nation of major contradictions. You see, whereas the advanced nations from which we borrowed heavily on making the constitution are nations of minor contradictions. So there was a great deal of adaptability, and here I would like to make one point. You remember Selig Harrison? He remarked in the 50s that India would break up. So that was in the mind of the constitution makers all the time, in the wake of the partition also, that we have to provide for a strong center. And the emergency power is also a reflection of that. And in that way, the centralization was necessary necessitated by the background and the dangers that the nation was facing, and also need to stabilize democracy in a country which was developing with very limited literacy and also very limited number of industrialization, because the advanced countries that we talk about are highly industrialized, and in India, industrialization had just begun.
So we've had 105 amendments of the Constitution of our country. Also, I'd like to ask you that, do you think that our Constitution reflects or meets the aspirations of millions of people, especially the diverse cultures that we have in every which way, diversity of language, diversity of culture, and so on? Do you think that as you say, Khara Sona?
Well, you see that in a way, India's uniqueness is also the beauty of India. If you really look to the number of amendments, they may look very large. But as I mentioned, you see, nation with major contradictions, a newly evolving nation, will have to look to many facets of life and problems. And so, if you really look to the surrounding that India had to deal with, then these contradictions are not very large. The point that I like to make is the essence of the Constitution, and then reinforced by the basic structure, remains. Many of the Constitution was necessitated to implement a particular legislation or the reorganization of the states or aspects like that. So that is bound to happen in a nation which was just beginning its journey, and the journey was not very smooth. The Indian Revolution and Indian freedom movement cannot be compared with the American one. So we had to evolve in a particular course, and I think looking to the contradictions and difficulties, it has performed very well.
And sir, our Constitution has steered through the times of internal and global turbulence. So how do you view that we have stood our ground and, as they say, समय की कसौटी पे खरा उतरा है? How do you view that?
Well, if you really look to the evolution of the Constitution, it is quite impressive. We began with the period when the first case, you remember the A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras, where the due process of the Americans were not accepted, and then we evolved procedure accepted by law. And there is also reason for it, because you see that in a nation like ours, where it was evolving for the first time in modern period, lot of caution was necessary. And so the judges concurred with the constitution makers that a balancing act is to be done. But slowly it also evolved that there is to be a balance between the three organs of the government. And you remember the Golaknath case, and ultimately 1973 the monumental judgment, the basic structure, which incidentally was won by only one vote, that really created a constitution structure which became more rigid but maintained the flexibility. And there are many challenges to it, the emergency being one, and the restoration in the 44th Amendment, and then up to the Minerva Mills. But I think by now it looks more or less settled, because the challenges that the Constitution faces, I think India has taken very well. For instance, the entire process of liberalization, we could accommodate quite well. Peaceful changes of government, that is also taking place quite smoothly. So I think one can really be appreciative of the process, and we can say that constitutionally we have reached the maturity essential.
So India is now on a roll. We know that in a week from now we shall be taking up the presidentship of G20 countries. We are also going digital in a big way. Today the Prime Minister launched various new initiatives under the E-Code project on this Constitution Day. Do you think that we are poised for a big leap forward and the Constitution is prepared for it?
I think so. You see, another 20 years we will become the third largest economy, and more or less, if you really look to India, is self-reliant. Even 2008 financial crisis did not affect India as it did many of the developed nations. You remember when we were young, it was the PL 480
yes.
food that we were dependent. Today we are the largest producer of milk. You look to the achievement of the IITs and IIMs and Indian Institute of Science, TIFR. I think if you really consider the process of evolution and the conditions, it is remarkable.
So our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, said that Indian Constitution is youth century and has urged government institutions and the judiciary to make endeavors to inculcate more awareness about our constitution among the youth particularly. In fact, the Prime Minister has encouraged the youth to actively take part in debates and discussions on the subject, and the fact that we are talking about it also adds to that whole milieu. What are your views on that?
Well, demographic advantage India has, tremendous potential. Now, if we can really use it properly with the opportunities, and now of course a private-public partnership has become essential, and we can build a national consensus in tackling the major problems, then I think the growth rate will also be faster, and even in the human development, we will do much better than what we are doing now. The young people are the asset of a nation, and if we can really provide the avenues to them and really encourage them to compete, I think they can do much wonderfully better than what they are doing now. And looking to the paucity of resources and all, even in that direction, I think there is a positive side that ultimately the future looks quite bright.
So we can say that our constitution has been a guiding light for the government and every citizen, and so shall it be always?
Absolutely. It's a constitution that has survived very well and a proper direction. People have become more aware and conscious of their rights and also of their duties. In that way, I think it's a success story.
Right. Professor Mukherjee, our constitution is probably the longest such a document in the world. What do you say about that?
Well, it's a very long constitution, no doubt about it. But if we really look to the circumstances when the constitution was made, there was no other alternative. First important point was that this was a massive constitutional exercise which will affect not only millions, crores of people, and will be giving direction to a nation which was just emerging. So first point that we should realize that though the Constitution takes a lot from the Government of India Act of 1935, with which we are familiar and participated in governance, but also the Constitution makers did not want to take any chance. You see, the point that they had in mind all the time, here I like to make the point of Grenville Austin. He says it's the oligarchy of four. Rajendra Prasad, the chairman, Maulana Azad, and Patel and Nehru, all of them put their heart and their influence in the political parties, in the society, to create a comprehensive constitution in which there would not be any chance of misrepresentation or omission. So that's why what you find is the details of administration and many of the acts which were omitted by the earlier constitution was taken up by the Indian constitution. Also the provision of the emergency powers, center-state relations. You see, they were detailed to a matter that will be surprising to observers of many other countries. The constitution makers, their first most priority was the unity of the nation. Second most priority was quick development within a limited period of time. The third important priority was to see that there is a larger acceptance of the constitution, though the illiteracy rate was very high and there was hardly any training of democracy in the colonial period. So achieve all these important things. They combined and made a detailed constitution so that the country does not suffer, and I think by now we'll all agree that country has not suffered.
Right. Also, the making of the constitution, the drafting process must have been a very daunting task considering that we are such a diverse country and the fact that we have managed from a time when we were illiterate to now when we are far more literate country and we are digitalized and we are the fifth largest economy in the world. The fact that it has absorbed so much, how do you view the making process?
Indian constitution has survived very well. Virtually nobody debates today about the alternative of a presidential system of government or a French model or any other. I think we have imbibed the spirit of the constitution and also we have followed the constitution process in a way, adapting with our conditions and also being flexible. So after the basic structure promulgation, I think by now there is a reasonable flexibility of the Constitution and also respect for the basic concepts that are essential for the continuance of a successful constitutional order. So I like to say that the Constitution document as it is has remained perfect.
Well said, Professor Mukherjee. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on constitutional values and fundamental principles of the Indian Constitution. The participants were Professor Subrata Mukherjee, political analyst, and Lalima Aneja Dang, AIR correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR.